Well, good evening, everybody. It's so good to see those of you who are here in the sanctuary and those of you who are joining us on the live stream. Welcome to night 2 of our inaugural Trotti lectures. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Wilson Kennedy. I'm one of the pastors here at First Pres, and it is an honor to welcome each of you, whether you're in this room or wherever you may be, to this wonderful lecture. We are truly in for a treat tonight. As you know, this lecture series was created by our Adult Ministries Committee in memory and in honor of the Reverend Dr. John Trotti, who many of you, knew for his exemplary teaching and pastoral ministry here at First Presbyterian for decades, and his scholarship and leadership over at Union Seminary. We were honored on Saturday night to have a reception out under the tent where it was warmer than it is in here tonight. And I promise you they're coming on Thursday and to warm it up in here. And then we were treated to a wonderful lecture by Reverend Dr. Brian Blunt, who's the president of Union, who helped us think a lot about looking at literature as a lens through which we might engage the biblical narrative, through which we might learn a little bit more about our own faith and how we might live into the fullness of that faith in our world and in our life and in our life together as the church. And so it was a wonderful occasion. I know many of you were here, either on the live stream or in person, and we are in for a treat tonight. Like I said, I'm honored to introduce the Reverend Melanie Jones, who is Assistant Professor of Christian Ethics and Director of the Katie Genevan Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at my alma mater, Union Presbyterian Seminary. And we are just so grateful for her to stand in our pulpit tonight and lecture to us on Bodies on the Line, Warrior Women, and Sacred Text. I asked Reverend Jones what I should say for introduction, and she said, just say that I teach at Union. So that's what I'm saying. She teaches at Union, which is a fine place. Let us open our time together with prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Reverend Jones. Let us pray. Holy and loving God, thank you for the gift of our minds, and thank you for the opportunities we have to deepen our discipleship to you through study and listening and questions and conversation. Illumine for us tonight what it is you might be teaching us so that we might go from this place to love and serve and challenge and question and most importantly, love. We do all this and pray all this in your Son's name, Jesus the Christ. Amen. Reverend Jones, thank you so much for being here.
Good evening. What an amazing honor it is to be here at First Presbyterian Church, and I am incredibly thankful for your warm welcome on this November evening. I want to offer gratitude first to Reverend Wilson Kennedy for your gracious invitation to join this lecture series and for your fine work in service to this congregation and community. I am indebted to Carolyn Wright and Britt Cash for your logistical and technical support, and I am indeed grateful for you, leaders, congregants, visitors, and friends, all those who are sharing with us tonight, both in person and online. I must admit that I am incredibly honored to follow the ranks of President Brian Blunt, who gave a remarkably crafted opening lecture this past Saturday, and to deliver some of my own womanist musings on religion and literature during this inaugural lecture series in memory of the Reverend Dr. John Boone Trotti, former professor and librarian at my home institution of Union Presbyterian Seminary. I never had the privilege to meet Dr. Trotti, but this lecture series is a testament to his beautiful mind, that his memory and legacy transcends his passing and continues to speak to us. While President Blunt skillfully unpacked the numerous ways Trotti's lectures, sermons, and writings offer a literature hermeneutic, a way of interpreting the contours of the Christian faith alongside the biblical canon, I invite us tonight to explore literature as sacred texts, or perhaps a spiritual pathway equipped with words that open our mystical worlds like portals, that connect us to the stories, testimonies, and memories of the great cloud of ancestral witnesses who bear the scars of the past and healing salve for the present and the future. I am particularly attuned to the power of literature when in this very state of Virginia, the banning of books is still a topic of discussion and contention, as Black women's literature like The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison and stories written by voices representing communities who are systemically excluded are on the chopping block of sorts, of whether they should be taught in schools because they explore pressing questions of critical race theory and gender and sexuality studies that address facets of lived human experience. The Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, known to many as the first Black woman ordained in the Presbyterian Church and the former Annie Scales Rogers Professor of Christian Ethics from 2001 to 2018 at Union Presbyterian Seminary, opened the field of Christian ethics by introducing Black women's literature as source and resource to confront and to expose and to do Christian ethics. When I first began teaching at New York Theological Seminary in 1977, Cannon describes, there were no books by Black women theologians. In her early teaching years, Cannon used novels, prose, poetry, short stories, biomythographies. Then she added nonfiction, biographies, and essays to discern Black women's God talk until the catalog grew wider. Cannon writes, quote, "The work of Black women writers can be trusted as seriously mirroring Black reality. Their writings are chronicles of Black survival. In their plots, actions, and depictions of characters, Black women writers flesh out the positive attributes of Black folk who are hidden beneath the ordinariness of everyday life. Black women writers know how to lift the imagination as they inform. They know how to touch the emotions as they record, how to delineate specifics so that they are applicable to the oppressed humanity everywhere. In essence, there is no better source for comprehending the real lived texture of the Black experience and the meaning of the moral life in the Black context than the Black women's literary tradition. Black women's literature offers the sharpest available view of the Black community's soul. From Cannon's dissertation, Black Womanist Ethics, to her first signature course, Resources for Constructive Christian Ethics, the Black women's literary tradition, to her namesake text, Katie's Canon, Womanism and the Soul of the Black Community, Cannon widens the scope of sacred text to include Black women's literature as a valuable resource for constructive ethics and a living repository that tells the truth of the moral agency and wisdom of Black women. Cannon writes, quote, "I contend that the Black women's literary tradition requires readers and students to constantly shift the territory of their normative gaze and the manner in which they see otherness, as ordinariness, as they journey through the allegorized terrain of racism, sexism, and classism that permeate the intriguing stories by African Americans. Throughout Black people's history in the Americas, doers of justice have consistently participated in a variety of literary undertakings and discursive interactions that identify the benchmarks of deviation from the legitimacy of white supremacy. Like Cannon in 1977, I too enter classrooms of seminary students in 2021 who have never read a book by an African-descended woman. Hence, the necessary reason for religious scholars and practitioners to continue to mine the motherlode of Black women's literature in order to debunk, unmask, and disentangle oppressive ideologies, theologies, and systems and move from death to life. Tonight's lecture falls just after the end of the month of October, known to many as Breast Cancer Awareness Month, where we remember those who have suffered and survived a disease that affects about 1 in 8 women in America alone. The images of women adorned in boxing gloves and the charge to fight like hell are plastered on memes and printed on t-shirts, evoking a warrior posture to resist the bodily threat by focusing on the fight and not the fright. Tonight's lecture falls just before Veterans Day, the American holiday that recognizes the millions of women and men who have risked their lives to serve in our armed forces. And the message, to be a warrior, peaks in commercials and advertisements as a military recruitment strategy and campaign. I am led this evening to engage in a conversation on the subject of bodies on the line, warrior women, and the sacred text. I begin with a poem. The women of Dan danced with swords in their hands to mark the time when they were warriors, by Audrey Lord. I did not fall from the sky, I nor descend like a plague of locusts to drink color and strength from the earth, and I do not come like rain as a tribute or symbol of earth's becoming. I come as a woman, dark and open. Sometimes I fall like night, softly and terrible, only when I must die in order to rise again. I do not come like a secret warrior with an unsheathed sword in my mouth, hidden behind my tongue, slicing my throat to ribbons of service with a smile while the blood runs down and out through holes in the 2 sacred mounds on my chest. I come like a woman, who I am, spreading out through nights, laughter and promise, and dark heat, warming whatever I touch that is living, consuming only what is already dead. As a young girl in the 90s, I grew up watching the TV show Xena, the Warrior Princess, chronicling the fascinating tale of a Grecian Amazon warrior who pursued a quest for redemption by dedicating her life to fighting for good. The program began as a spinoff to Hercules, the legendary journeys recounting the titillating adventures of the heroic son of Zeus, Hercules as told in Greek mythology. Xena's popularity as a fearless female warrior garnered greater popular attention than the Herculean production, thus airing 2 years longer. Although it was clear to me then that Xena was a character in a made-for-TV mythological fantasy world, her aim to fight the powerless against warlords and legionaries and deities felt familiar even at adolescence. My elemental memories of warrior women have profound spiritual significance, stemming back to one of the first Women's Day sermons that I can remember preached by my mother, entitled, "Get Ready to Rumble." The sermon articulated the astonishing narrative of Deborah in Judges 4 and 5, who served as a fiery judge, prophet, and female warrior leader to the Israelite people. The story begins in Judges 4 and 6 with Deborah approaching a senior officer of the Israelite army, Barak, about a command from Yahweh to go to battle. Barak replies with an invitation to Deborah to go together with him to the battleground to overthrow Sisera. The text suggests that Deborah's presence carries so much influence that a commander-in-chief cannot go to war without her. Deborah willingly accompanies Barak to the battleground and serves as a prophetic intermediary for Yahweh and military strategist, thus enabling Israelites' success and victory. Just as Deborah's name derived from the Hebrew consonant, which means she spoke, Deborah emerges as a word-warring woman who uses words and songs to pronounce Israel's military triumph. My mother was fascinated with Deborah, but I was captured by the story of Jael, who lured her opponent Sisera into the tent. While Sisera was fast asleep, assuming Jael was no real threat, Jael scores a tent peg and drives it through the forehead of Sisera into the ground. Jael shows the fallen body to Barak and accomplishes what Barak, the skilled military general, could not. And Sisera is delivered into the hand of the woman. The tradition praises Jael in Judges 5 and 24, declaring her as the most blessed of tent-dwelling women. It is through the warrior women of Judges in the biblical text and my mother's fierce word-warring preaching that I learned of women in written and oral accounts of warrior women in antiquity. While the Bible is replete with tales of warrior women in canonical and non-canonical writings, Annette, my mother, Zena, Deborah, and Jael remain nascent spiritual, visual, and literary depictions of warring women who exercise their agency and power to advocate for their communities. In doctoral studies, I learned about the fascinating narrative of the Ashanti female warrior and queen mother Yaa Asantewaa. She led male Asante warriors to battle against the British when the Asante king, Nana Primpa, and other royal officers were captured and sent to Seychelles Island at the turn of the 20th century. Yaa Asantewaa's alternative military strategies of using drums to distract British armed forces with the manipulation of sounds struck my interest. Though she and her male army fought well, eventually Yaa Asantewaa faced imprisonment by the British and deportation to the Seychelles Island, where she died in 1923. Much like Zena and Deborah, Yaa Asantewaa represented warrior women who served as royal frontrunners and military commanders that were leaders in their own right, but often led and participated in armed warfare alongside men. The story of Yaa Asantewaa provoked my curiosity of the legacy of warrior women in pre-colonial West Africa and whether more substantiated documentation of warrior women troops existed that were either Yaa Asantewaa's contemporaries or before her time. I have often heard of African diasporan warrior women, queens throughout antiquity like Nefertiti of ancient Egypt, Nzinga of modern-day Angola, Candace of Ethiopia, Nanda in southern Africa, the three female warriors of the West Indies, Queen Mary, Queen Agnes, and Queen Matilda, and Queen Nanny of the Jamaican Maroons, all who waged war as royal heads or commanders. But very rarely are large bands of warrior women who fought together. Their stories are often hidden. The white Grecian Amazons televised in my formative years depicted mythological bands of ruthless female fighters, but I wanted to trace the mystical glimpses of real African warrior women, like the women of Dan described in Audrey Lord's poem, that once existed in pre-colonial Dahomey or Dahomey, which became the starting point for uncovering deep in historical ravines their ancestral legends. While there are countless tales of warring women throughout classical antiquity, the warrior women often named Black Amazons of the pre-colonial West African Dahomey Kingdom, which existed roughly 1600 to 1900 in today's Republic of Benin. These are perhaps the lone, thoroughly documented historical cadre of women who placed their bodies on the line in active combat for the state. Tonight, I briefly recount the socio-political backdrop of the pre-colonial Dahomey Kingdom's quest for expansion, the West African slave trade, and the European invasion that made the formation of the Black Amazons possible. Then I moved to engage the real lived texture of Black women's literature, turning to two 20th century poets and prophets, Audrey Lord and Lucille Clifton, who survived pain and loss by linking their ancestral heritage to warrior women of Dahomey and placing their bodies on the line as word warriors in their writings. In the age of warmongering, where there is global interest to wage war for vicious and virtuous reasons, I argue reclaiming a warrior spirit is necessary for those who live in battle zones of multi-dimensional oppression and whose bodies exist on the front lines of multiple injustices. The warrior women of Dahomey reflect a noble and powerful tradition for all of us. These are warrior women who seek to annihilate oppression by sharing power versus holding power. These are women who are unafraid to confront the taming and sterilization of bodies and pleasures, and who seek to join with other women and allies to do so. There is no exact date marking the founding of the Kingdom of Dahomey. Historians suggest that the Dahomey people were descendants of the Fon people from Togo, or present-day Togo, who journeyed southeastward as early as the 1600s. The Abomi Plateau, located 60 miles from the West African coast, situated the palace inland in cool, rainy weather, and the Dahomey Kingdom close to coastal trade, wooded grassland, and food. Unfortunately, the lack of a thick forest also left Dahomey vulnerable to attack, and the desire for security and safety prompted Dahomey's expansion to Alada and Wida and other neighboring lands. Historians agree that the Dahomeyan state gained economic support and national stability from European travelers and the West African slave trade. The rise of the Kingdom of Dahomey took place alongside the growth of the slave trade in Africa and the persistent threat of European colonial rule in the 18th and 19th centuries. In simple terms, the Dahomeyan Kingdom, as a monarchical and militaristic culture, was under constant attack by colonial invaders and thus in need of warrior women. The reign of King Gezo marks the period most historians identify warrior women gained their prominence, of several thousand compatriots, and received institutionalization as a core branch in the Dahomeyan state. By the 1840s, European travelers named the warrior women seen in Dahomey Amazons. These French historian Stanley Alpern makes a strong comparative connection between classical and fantastical Amazons and the warrior women of Dahomey in the European imagination. Alpern writes, quote, "Remarkably, the fantasticized Amazon of antiquity and the real Amazons of Dahomey share a good number of attributes. From an early age, both were taught to fight, to handle weapons, to be strong and swift and hardy, to withstand suffering. Hunting, dancing, and instrumental music were among their skills. Their basic purpose in life was to make war. They lusted for battle, rushed into it with fury and valor, seemingly immune to fear. In victory, they were pitiless. They terrified their neighbors. Men regarded them as worthy, implacable adversaries. On the other hand, there were notable differences. The Amazons of Dahomey never rode horses or any other animals. Instead of bows, spears, and axes, their main weapons were muskets, clubs, and machetes. They rarely used shields. Their breasts stayed intact. They were vowed to celibacy, and they did not produce their own replacements. Like their ancient forerunners, they lived by themselves, but in royal palaces, not off somewhere autonomously. They fought in an army with a male majority. Though they had their own officers, they were ultimately ruled by men. They were, in fact, completely devoted to their king and would die for him, which they often did. End quote. Three principal facets of the warrior women of Dahomey emerge for our analysis. They were monarchical subjects. While the Europeans named the Dahomey female warriors Amazons, they called themselves Ahosi and Mino, representing their relationship to the monarch as royal wives and mothers. A great number of women surrounding the king worked to diminish internal and external male threats from getting close to the king and or overthrowing his rule. At night, men were not allowed inside the palace with the exception of eunuchs. The women that lived in the palace were subject to the king and known as Ahosi or royal wives, holding various offices and positions in the monarch, including female warriors. Alpern notes, quote, every unmarried female in Dahomey was potentially the king's wife. To become a warrior woman, no matter how humble her origins, she joined the female elite. Warrior women spent their days in periods of unrest, toning their bodies for war, perfecting their weaponry skills, and unearthing new lines of attack. They also worked in agriculture, pottery, and herding to support their living in seasons of rest. By night, these women enjoyed the pleasures of their separate palace quarters for their pleasures: quilting, making music, and dancing. The term Mino, often named by the warrior women as mothers of the palace, signified their continued opportunity for advancement and promotion in the kingdom. Royal offices were mostly doubled with male and female positions at every level. Historian Etna Bay makes the claim that Pogito, queen mothers, function as reignmates alongside the king with their own royal court and leadership autonomy. The Pogito was the highest officer in the female court, overseeing legal disputes and establishing religious authority. No documentation suggests they initiated attacks or began formal military processionals without the sanction of the king. Because these women were willing to fight on behalf of the king and claim their identity as protectors of the state, these women are monarchical subjects who exercise their agency, though it is limited by regulatory control. Here, state and male domination meet. Second, these women were binary breaking radicals. The sheer fact that a female armed brigade existed in the Dahomeyan army is a testament to the bending of traditional West African gender roles. Warrior women participating in active combat and regular military training shifted the paradigm of women's roles in West Africa, which alarmed European surveillance. The warriors' women's presence attracted European men who witnessed military processions with confusion of whether to call the suited soldiers women or men, mainly because they flipped Eurocentric notions of martial activities as unique to men only. I raise the term genderqueer to illustrate the blurring of the binaries in Dahomean warrior women's gender performance. Though more men made up the Dahomean army, the warrior women often surpassed their male doubles, performing martial warfare better than their fellows did. Some songs suggested the warrior women were fiery as lions, not men. Other songs gave the impression that as the members of the Gazo army, they were reborn and transformed into men. Historically, this is not atypical that women who achieve an elite status or power or skill face typification as men. But to initiate women into this course and suppress connections with the world outside, the state required warrior women to take a vow of celibacy, which explicitly meant no sexual relations with men. It is reasonable to assume that pregnancy could have comprised or compromised a warrior woman's physical dexterity on the battlefield, and the vow of celibacy surfaced to tame her body as well as sterilize her offspring. The wall that surrounded the women's quarters symbolized separation from outsiders. When the king invited the warrior women to mate with him or his designates, the vow of celibacy lost its rigidity. The king often twisted the vow on multiple occasions when requiring some warrior women to seduce men into the Dahomean army or marry high-ranking officials when they became too ill or too old to fight. Vow bending or breaking was common, given the religious rhetoric warning that maintained a deity guarded the woman's chaste sexuality and punished any offenders. Alpern writes, a deity represented at certain palace gates was thought to watch over the chastity of the soldieress. If an Amazon committed adultery, the spirit made her pregnant, or in one version, gave her a bowel disease, thus exposing her crime. If she was found guilty, both she and her male lover faced capital punishment. Because of this cautionary prescription, some warrior women refrained from sexual exchanges with other men. However, this vow concerns ways these women fulfilled their pleasures in the privacy of their quarters. Vow breaking or bending was common for warrior women who did not want to face the state or the divine punishment by birthing offspring. Hence, the warrior women of Dahomey are transformed or offer transformed gender binaries, practicing diverse expressions of gender identity as well as sexuality. The final factor of the warrior women is fearless rebellion. Warrior women in Dahomey put their bodies on the line in the warfare for the Dahomean monarch and state. Whether they were patriots or narcissists, they were fighting to protect the Dahomean way of life, and their efforts came with tragic bodily costs. The numerous military successes, unfortunately, did not outweigh the reality that the warrior women were wounded, injured, enslaved, imprisoned, and even killed in battle. Doubling their male counterparts in the army, the warrior women, even as minorities, fought with a great measure of passion and zeal that often exceeded their male soldiers. These warrior women were ferocious and willing to die, often not using shields to protect their body as they fought for bloodshed until the very end. This photographic account of a lone warrior woman reveals the story of conquering, or her story of conquering the enemy, as she returns from battle with a spear in one hand and the head of her opponent dripping with fresh blood in the other. The fall of the warrior women in Dahomey came with the subsequent fall of the Dahomey kingdom to French colonialism. Thousands of warrior women died in these wars alongside their male counterparts, not because they were unprepared or outnumbered, but because they were overpowered by advanced French ammunition. Beninese scholar Emile de Bello wrote her dissertation in 1979 entitled Les Amazones de Dahomey after meeting several surviving warrior women and a woman named Nawi in the village of Kinta in 1978, who she believed was the last living Amazon. It is not until de Bello's work that mention of a surviving Dahomean warrior women was acknowledged. Here I turn to the warrior legacy retentions in literature. Less than a century since the Dahomean warrior women's dissolution, Audrey Lord and Lucille Clifton reclaimed the legacy of warrior women in their writings. Lord and Clifton remain among the most prolific poets and writers of the 20th century, each providing different but equally prominent contributions to literature, poetry, and artistry. The experiences of Lord and Clifton as African diasporan women in America differ from the warrior women of Dahomey by land, water, time, and context, but there are undeniable linkages that remain. Both Lord and Clifton claim relation to the warrior women of Dahomey explicitly in their writings as a source of empowerment. Although the warrior women of Dahomey did not have their breasts removed for warfare, both Lord and Clifton find solace and comfort in the Amazonian legacy of the one-breasted woman. As women, both Lord and Clifton, who navigated breast cancer and mastectomies. Lord and Clifton placed their bodies on the line to make the personal not just political but prophetic in their writing and activism. In most societies, a woman of color exists on the underside of humanity. To be Afro-Caribbean, lesbian, mother, socialist, feminist, and womanist is to live as a pariah in a white supremacist heteropatriarchal world. Audrey Lord's contradicting identities locate her between multiple battles and social movements. She utilizes these realities to wage war against what she names as silence and sameness. Audrey Lord takes seriously the question, what does it mean to be a sister outsider? She locates her multiple identities as inside the struggle against injustices, but outside the politics of respectability for the freedom fighters of her day. Warrior represents her position against silence and everything that seeks to nullify difference. Lord writes, quote, "My silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you." Lord names herself Gamda Adisa, a warrior poet, and she plays with battle imagery and military metaphors, assuming a warrior symbolism all throughout her work. Lord's work is replete with stumbling paradoxes as she is unafraid to connect war with her love for women. Her poem outlines, "I trace the curve of your jaw with a lover's finger, knowing the hardest battle is only the first. How to do what we need to do for our living with honor and in love. We have chosen each other and the edge of each other's battles. The war is the same. If we lose someday, women's blood will congeal upon a dead planet, and if we win, there is no telling." Lord's writings convey a malignant body politic as she uses her bodily experience with breast cancer to confront a cancer-risk society. The Cancer Journals and A Burst of Light narrate Lord's fight with breast cancer and serve as her personal manifesto to expose the threats on life or the forces of death lurking in a death-dealing society. "The only really happy people," Lord quotes, "I have ever met are those of us who work against these deaths with all of our energy, recognizing the deep and fundamental unhappiness with which we are surrounded at the same time as we fight to keep from being submerged by it." But if the achievement and maintenance of perfect happiness is only the secret of a physically healthy America, healthy life in America, then it is a wonder that we are not all dying of a malignant society, end quote. Lord's fight against what has already died by its forced prosthesis on bodies and deformation of pure happiness exposes that silence, the denial of a woman's voice and experiences and sameness. The intentional repudiation of difference represents deadly forces that kill happiness, laughter, relationships, bodies, and pleasures. Thus, Lord desires to be a warrior, like the warrior women of Dahomey, those who fight against the threats that reflect a warrior strategy that is committed to annihilating what is already dead. Lucille Clifton is the word wizard who captures profundity in short and simple verses with the most explicit focus on the female body in her writing. Lucille Clifton traces her patrilineal lineage to Dahomey women in her poems and memoir account generations. Clifton's worldview is bent on her descent from Dahomey women. Thus, she takes her life shaped by the passing down of the words of her great-grandmother, "Get what you want, you from Dahomey women." Generations recounts her family narrative as she travels for her father's funeral and traces her paternal bloodline all the way back to Dahomey. The memoir begins with the white woman calling her, looking for information about the Sell family. Unknowingly, the woman who is calling her black kin, who has a slightly altered last name, exposes the American story of racial intermixing and dismisses the notion that black people do not know their history. It is Clifton who knows more than her white blood relative about their shared family origins. Clifton establishes her great-grandmother Caroline Donald as a woman who was shipped to Dahomey from Dahomey enslaved but died free. In her poem, Kylene's Prayer, remember me from Wida, remember the child running across Dahomey, black as ripe papaya, juicy as sweet and berries, and set me in the rivers of your glory, Yamaya. Though Caroline came to America as an enslaved African, knowledge of her roots as a Dahomey woman helped her to gain freedom. Caroline's repeated refrain, "Get what you want, you from Dahomey women," makes clear to Clifton that Dahomey women are born and bred warriors. Caroline birthed a girl child named Lucy. Lucy slept with a white man, Harvey Nichols, in mutual affection, and they bore a son, Gene. When Lucy found out that Gene had a withered arm, she killed Harvey at the railroad tracks and stood there in plain sight. Clifton narrates Lucy's legend from her father's storytelling. Yes, Lord, he was born with a withered arm and he was still just a baby. Lucy waited by the crossroad one night for Harvey Nichols to come to her. And when he rode up on a white horse and killed him, Lou, and she didn't run away. She raided right there by the body with a rifle in her hand to the horse coming back empty, saddled to the stable, brought a mob to see what had become of Harvey Nichols. And when they got to the crossroad, they found Lucy standing there with rifle in her hand. And they didn't lynch her, Lou, because she was Mama Kylene's child and from Dahomey women. They had a legal trial, and Lucy was found guilty and hanged. Because of Caroline's reputation, the mobs did not lynch Lucy for killing a white man cold-blooded, but she did become the first woman in Virginia to be hung. Lucille Clifton, carrying the name of her grandmother and the image of fearless rebels, bears the legacy of warrior women in her blood. Blood is a recurring theme in Lucille's writing. Blood is a vital ingredient to life. It is also the sign of the loss of life. Clifton loses the 2 extra fingers she was born with at an early age. Her uterus, a breast to her husband. She lost her husband to cancer. She lost her child to brain tumors, and she even lost her kidney. Is a woman still a woman when her womanly parts are gone? Is she still a warrior when her body becomes her opponent? Clifton draws on these experiences of body loss to develop a body language in conversation with her breast and uterus, her hips and hair, her size and her delta, and even her stars. Clifton's story, the Dahomean warrior legacy, reemerges in the sense that fearless rebellion does not come without tragic bodily costs. When her eldest daughter, who she once tried to abort, is the more than perfect blood match to give her a kidney and preserve her life, the poem Donor begins or brings into the forefront that warrior women are not sterile, but they birth warrior women. The warrior legacy then is in her blood. It is her bloodline that situates her in the line of Dahomey women, but also her daughter's congenial antibodies and antigens that save her body from initial kidney failure. Clifton does blood work in her writings to illuminate the knowledge of her family's bloodline despite the threats to sever her story and the unwavering commitment to fight for her life against all odds. Her poem captures it clearly. Won't you celebrate me? Come celebrate me. That every day something has tried to kill me and failed. Lord and Clifton expose Black women face multidimensional oppression that is intersecting and interlocking as Black women's bodies exist further away from the white, male, affluent, able-bodied norm. The crossways of race, gender, class, and sexuality reveal Black women's bodies exist in battle zones of multidimensional oppression, facing the threat of death at multiple terms. Structural systems of oppression in America are not just vicious, but function, to borrow from womanist theologian Dolores Williams, as demonarchy, taunting the very humanity of Black women. Seemingly, a warrior spirit is necessary to fight against systems and powers that dehumanize, dispossess, and disenfranchise others. To make it plain, any death-dealing force that seeks to deny one's human dignity is worth the fight. 21st century interpreters ask the question from Lord and from Clifton's writing, must I be a warrior? The call for warrior women in a contemporary era is a call for those who explicate an ethical sensibility that rallies against all forms and manners of oppression and advocates for the liberation of the most vulnerable. Such a task also involves a communitarian aim seeking the collective well-being as the goal of social change. The call for warrior women, today's warrior women, are those in the contemporary eclipsing of women's reproductive rights that marks a continuing battle for the social control of women. Today's warriors must resist with vigilance the taming and sterilizing of women's bodies and pleasures by state and religious authorities. And today's warriors, the realities of supremacy, white supremacy, patriarchy, racism, sexism, heterosexism, and every other ism are structural systems that function to sever ties and disrupt relationships. Today's warriors are those who must intentionally resister in the pursuit to eradicate oppression. In every war, there are casualties and often more battles than victories. The coming together of warrior women is not a closed circle, but an open invitation to women across racial, sexual, class, and transnational lines who are willing to risk their bodies and selves to join the fight against multi-dimensional oppression. I end tonight's lecture in the same way that I began, with a poem, Amazons by Lucille Clifton. When the rookery of woman, warriors, all each cupping one hand around her remaining breast, daughters of Dahomey, their name fierce on the planet, when they came to ask, who knows what you might have to sacrifice, poet, Amazon, there is no choice. Then when they each with one nipple lifted beckoned to me 5 generations removed, I rose and ran to the telephone to hear. Cancer, early detection, no mastectomy, not yet. There was nothing to say. My sister swooped in a circle dance. Audrey was with them, and I had already written this poem. Thank you.
Reverend Jones, thank you so much for your lecture and for teaching us tonight. I am just so grateful for your scholarship and your presence here in this sanctuary. I think it's striking that you used this image from Black Panther to close your lecture this evening. And if it's okay, I'd like to engage in a few minutes of questions with you. And if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand, and I will, I'm going to ask this question, Steve, then I'll come to you in just a second. And I will repeat it just because with our sound system, it's easier for me to repeat it. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about why you chose this image, because at least for me, your lecture kind of drew me to Black Panther because I think it's something that is fresh in my mind, having watched it several times. So I'd love for you to kind of explain why you chose this image.
Absolutely. I think most folks' orientation to warrior women happens, as I narrated, through television, through cinematography, through these kind of mythical representations. The emergence of Black Panther by Marvel in 2018, in 2 weeks, it was grossing $700 million. And the breakout characters were these warrior women. Folks had never heard of Black Amazons, which is always a kind of orientation, a pop culture reference that I always draw upon. But what's significant about this story, there is a scene in Black Panther when Nakia, who is the Wakandan spy who is supporting the Black Panther, and General Okoye, who is played here by Dana Guerrera, they have an exchange. Nakia, who is played by Lupita Nyong'o, they have an exchange, and they're talking about this quest for salvation. And General Okoye says, I will participate in saving Wakanda by supporting the king. And Nakia, the Wakandan spy, says, no, I'm participating in saving Wakanda by, saving the entire community and making sure that, all of our culture and tradition is preserved, right? So this exchange opened up for me ways in which the warrior women, as depicted in Black Panther, mirrored ways in which warrior women of Dahomey were monarchical subjects. Their loyalty was to the king, even as they were ferocious resistors. However, if their ability or if the capacity or the environment opened it up for the possibility to shift their energy not in promise of the king, but toward the issues that matter for their community, how much more, right, will we benefit from the legacy of this brigade of warrior women? And that's essentially what I'm trying to get at in the lecture, is when we talk about warrior women, we cannot forget this historically documented cadre of Black Amazons. But also, if warrior women preserve some kind of legacy of who we should be as human beings, as ethical and moral subjects, if there's something that we need to reclaim, perhaps we might learn that there is promise in us being communal subjects, right? Ability to work collaboratively and to share power amongst the groups. Perhaps there is possibility for us to resist the taming and sterilization of bodies and pleasures, right? To tell people how they should be in the world, how they should love, and so forth. And then lastly, perhaps this opens up the possibility for us to see kind of warrior women as a communal group that intentionally grabs the abilities and the perspectives and the voices of other women, that intentionally allies in this way, right? And it sees the warrior women's kind of legacy as not something that is the kind of Herculean, long, mighty warrior that wins on his own, but rather there is something that happens that makes potential for all of us when we do this together.
I really appreciate you kind of expanding on that, because that I think that they use the word communitarian in the lecture to describe, that the aim here is not just in service to the monarch or in service, but it's also not in the same token subversion. Mm-hmm. And you never used that word, which I thought was really interesting. That we're really, what you're claiming, and I think this is so important, is that we work in this together utilizing the unique gifts and experiences of each person. And what you've lifted up in this lecture is really the unique gifts and perspectives of women of color, the Dahomean women of antiquity, but then how that strain still continues through to today. I think that's really powerful. Thank you for teaching me that. I'm grateful. Steve, do you have a question? So just so everybody here is on the live stream, Steve has asked the question, inviting Reverend Jones to reflect on the impact of the Christian faith, or to comment on how the person of Christ has, may have played into the Dahomean spirit that you talked about.
Yeah. In parallel, I think that we popularize, in terms of our kind of rhetoric, Christian rhetoric, we popularize very monarchical language, like Christ the King, and all of these images that support only kind of male gendered notions of the divine. The warrior women and remembering their story opens us up to what aspects of Christ, what aspects of the divine do we miss when we only use rhetoric that supports this kind of male ordering? Perhaps, do these women provide us with another entry point or another lesson of a way of thinking about the divine in light of their stories? I would say that in the second part, I talk about these women as binary breakers, and as radicals in that way. And what they were often up against was not only societal pressures of social control or state pressures of social control, but they were also up against religious pressures of social control. And part of what I'm getting at is the ways in which when we talk about sterilization and the taming of women's body, that is not just a societal reality. Those are things that are happening in the church that we need to confront. So in that sense, I think there is quite a lot of parallels that we might make in terms of rhetoric, in terms of language, in terms of who we envision as Christ, right? And what we see the role of Christ when Christ acts as warrior or as mighty. Are we also thinking about Christ as the one who is acting for social change or to change or to radicalize communities, right? So I only have 45 minutes to make all of the connections, but I hope that I'm making some subtle linkages there.
I really appreciate your response to this question, because it reminds me of how we have an obligation as people of faith to expand our horizons of hermeneutics, to make a connection to Dr. Bryant. Who are we listening to teach us about not only the history of our faith, the good stuff and the bad stuff, but also who's teaching us about the Bible, who's teaching us about these sacred texts, and who is informing our study in our lives of faith. And I really appreciate you lifting up that part of what we have to do is expand our understandings of how we talk about faith, the language we use, and our points of orientation, our points of connection to the persons, of the Trinity in our understanding. So I appreciate that. Are there other questions or comments? I know we're right at our hour time, but I wanted to make sure everyone had a chance to ask a question if you've got one. Well, if not, Reverend Jones, thank you so much again for being here. We are grateful. She'll be up at the front. Please come and greet her and thank her for being with us tonight. For those of you on the live stream, thank you so much for being here for this inaugural Trotti lecture, and I will close us with a word of prayer. Let's pray. Gracious God, we are grateful for new and fresh expressions that draw us closer to you. Thank you for all the people you have created. Thank you for the grand, holy diversity of our world. And help us create a world, co-create a world with you where all stories are known, where all histories are treated as truth, and where we all might feel your love in your presence and your holy embrace in our world and in our lives. Go with us this night. Keep us safe as we travel until that time we meet again. In your Son's holy and precious name we do pray. Amen. Thank you for being here.